everything from here on will be useful. Hopefully that should come up there. There's always these technical difficulties, aren't there?
No, it's up now. It's perfect.
Great. Well, we can leave it there in that case. So as Imelda has said, I am the social theologian at the Jesuit Center for Faith and Justice. So if you want to track our work, it's easily accessible online with jcfj.ie. And yeah, I'm just going to get stuck into this. I've been asked to talk this morning about inequality, exclusion, and racism in Ireland. Oh wait, has that come up? Sorry, guys.
If you just play your slideshow, we have.
One moment.
That's okay.
There we go. Has that come up? Give me a second here, guys.
That's
I
okay.
apologize.
That's okay.
I have a degree in computer science, believe it or not, and it still doesn't really help me when it comes to these Zoom things.
Kevin, if you go to the slideshow and then
yes,
you click on the current slide or play from the beginning.
Okay.
So just go back there, then I can just go.
From beginning there. So has that come up?
I can't see it now. We can see it.
You'll have to share that now, Kevin.
Give me a second, guys. My apologies.
That's perfect, Kevin.
One moment.
It's bigger than we might.
Does that work? There.
Yeah.
We're up. We're ready to go. Thank you very much for your patience. So, and we're ready. I've been asked to talk this morning about inequality, exclusion, and racism in Ireland. These three phenomena are never found alone. Where there's inequality, exclusion follows. Where there's racism, you'll often find exclusion was there first. This is a toxic dynamic, a sort of chemical reaction of marginalization that plagues our society. Now, it's important to be clear about what we mean. I define inequality as a material, primarily economic phenomenon, whereby our society disproportionately rewards the already well-rewarded. And that generates a sort of hierarchy where those who are at the bottom are left behind. Many of you are very familiar with this. Exclusion is harder to reduce to averages, to percentages, to euro amounts, but it names a similar dynamic in terms of social capital, where certain groups of people face barriers and obstacles to access what is taken for granted by others. Racism, which is a particular form of prejudice directed at individuals or collective communities based around, based around racial or ethnic designations. So today, I'm going to particularly focus on race for two reasons. Firstly, my source material is a little story told by a Jewish mystic in Palestine 2 millennia ago, which deals explicitly with racial questions. And secondly, while inequality and exclusion have been discussed openly in Ireland for decades, there's a newfound willingness to approach sensitive questions around racial and ethnic discrimination. So my example of that is Hazel Chu, who's the Lord Mayor of Dublin. She's spoken about how now there's a, quote, certain openness to talking about race relations, things that were very present, but that we tended to sweep under the carpet once upon a time. So this dynamic that I'm describing where inequality, exclusion, and racism comes together, it's pernicious. A child is born in Ireland, let's imagine, to a racial minority. They face countless small obstacles every day because of their apparent difference. We've come to call this microaggressions. And while each individual challenge that they face could be handled, the cumulative effect is significant. And so by dint of being visibly part of a minority, they're also members of an excluded class. Therefore, their parents are likely to have limited employment opportunities, and that means that they could grow up in poverty, experiencing inequality, and so the cycle continues. Many of you will be familiar with this. This morning, I'm going to draw on two stories, the Good Samaritan and a story about a friendship that was formed 250 years ago between two men, Jonathan Strong and Granville Sharp. I'm going to propose that through these two stories, that one response to the toxic dynamics of inequality, exclusion, and racism in contemporary Ireland is the idea of what Pope Francis calls social friendship. This concept has come to prominence most recently in the writings of Francis. And social friendship is his way of articulating the synthesis that's required between the personal and the political, so that our interventions on the crises of injustice we face operate both at the level of authentic human friendship and at the level of meaningful political and social transformation. And this is grounded, Francis says, on the acknowledgement of the worth of every human person, always and everywhere. So what I propose is that by cultivating an attentiveness to how these toxic dynamics are at play in our society, we can make an essential first step in combating them. So instead of inequality, racism, and exclusion, we can move towards a society of equality, of inclusion, and of mutual respect. So if that sounds good, let's get stuck in. I want to tell this amazing story that I think is much too underknown, which is the story of Strong and Sharp. Jonathan Strong was born in Barbados, a slave. In 1765, as a teenager in England, he was beaten with the butt of a gun by his master, David Lyle. He was left practically blind on the street, like a broken tool, abandoned. Now, a civil servant named Granville Sharp walked by. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He took him first to his brother William, who was a surgeon, and then to Bart's Hospital, where he arranged for the 4-month stay required to recuperate. And when he was healed, they continued to care for him. They arranged a job for him. They befriended him. Now, after a year, the old slave trader, Lyle, saw Strong in the street, and he reclaimed what he said was his property. He said that Strong was a runaway and that he owned him and that he was going to sell him again. He arranged a deal with a Jamaican planter named James Kerr to sell this human being for £30, 30 pieces of silver. When the henchman came to claim Strong, word was sent to Sharp, and he went straight to the Lord Mayor, and they went straight to the courts. And while it's a long, long story, which involved Sharp having to teach himself the law so that he himself could defend his friend Strong, the efforts of these two friends led eventually to slavery being conclusively banned in Britain, which was an essential but often overlooked step towards its thorough abolition achieved a generation later. So my friends, I start this morning with this great news. The story of the Good Samaritan is true. In Granville and Sharp, we see it enacted in real life, and we see the consequences of that kind of boundary transgressing love and friendship, also combined with a commitment to social change. Now, last autumn, many of you will know Pope Francis published his third encyclical, and it's about social friendship, and it's called Fratelli Tutti, which is quite a sexist name, really, because it's about his brothers. But I interpret that to include everybody as it's meant to be interpreted. And he talks about all of the crises that we're facing in our society. He talks about the pandemic, but he also discusses the migrant crisis. And he offers a pretty precise description of what racism looks like in our contemporary world. He says, no one will ever openly deny that these people are human beings, but in practice, by our decisions and the way we treat them, we show that we consider them less worthy, less important, less human. And I think that this is a very accurate description of how my racism functions. You'll never catch me using a racial slur. I'll never openly engage in any kind of prejudice or bias. But below the surface, even below my conscious action, my white supremacy and my racist tendencies are surely exposed to the Lord. Our actions are where racism actually functions primarily. Now, I was raised thinking that racism was a sort of horrible disease that afflicted people in the past. You know, raised on Hollywood movies, I thought that racism was this ghoulishly evil thing, you know, men dressed in white cloaks who were riding around terrorizing people. As the story went, this was epidemic in the United States. But as I was raised in Ireland in the 1980s, we were taught we couldn't be racist because we loved Paul McGrath. We loved Phil Lynott. We didn't have those problems. I was born in 1981, so I was already an adult when Ireland began its wonderfully successful experiment in welcoming immigrants. And it's one of the aspects of social change in our society that we should note with more joy, that for the large part, we have become a multicultural society. And for the large part, that has happened without the kinds of protests that have occurred elsewhere. But to acknowledge that shouldn't be an excuse for hiding away from the reality of racism and prejudice in our society. So I never encountered any stereotypical racist opinions from those who were older than me or my peers. But then again, since all my teachers were white and all my peers were white and I'm white, I would barely have noticed if our culture was permeated with the aggressions that we pass off as jokes. Sometimes I was exposed to jokes at the expense of Protestants, but they were a group so similar to Catholics that you practically have to have a degree in theology to understand the difference. And God always has the last laugh, of course, because I went from being a baptized Catholic to an atheist, and now I'm a Presbyterian. So in my full circle, I'm working as a theologian for the Jesuits. So you could take me as a classic example of the progress that has been made within Irish society, because you know the sectarianism that once plagued our society is definitely eroded if you can have a Presbyterian elder leading a social center for the Jesuits. But we still have to recognize that there's something addictive about our desire to mark people into groups who are in and into groups who are out, groups who are running just below the surface of Irish life. So through the 1980s and the 1990s, even up into the very recent past, it was widely believed, at least among white settled people, I'm sure every traveller in the country could have told you the truth, but it was widely believed that Ireland had avoided the racist illness. We consoled ourselves self-righteously with the ironic assumption that racism was a problem suffered by other people. The Brits might be racist, but not us. The Americans, they're racist, but not us. And if our consciences did prick us about how we spoke of the immediate other in our midst, the Protestant or the traveller or the gay person, Irish culture has ingrained in us this impenetrable defense. We say, sure, we were just having the crack. The crimes we've committed under the camouflage of banter. When I first read Fratelli Tutti, I was struck by how accurate Francis was. Racist speech is now taboo speech, at least in the public square. There's not going to be any Ku Klux Klan branches opened in Kilkenny or Killarney. Oliver Flanagan was a hugely popular TD from the middle of the 20th century. He talked openly in the Dáil about the need to rout the Irish Jewish population. That's the kind of racist speech that was tolerated in the 1900s. Now, Oliver's son is a TD. He was recently the Minister for Justice, and he has taken a completely different approach. He's a vocal supporter of anti-racism strategies. So Charlie Flanagan's example, where he has moved so far away from his father's racism, is a sign of healthy progress. But that, again, shouldn't be taken to mean that we have evolved beyond or overcome the problem of racism. Francis cautions us, it's relatively easy to say the right things, but do we back them up with action? And I don't need to tell you guys, but the temporary halting sites and the direct provision centres and the education that is offered in the parts of Dublin or Limerick or Waterford, where there are lots of recent immigrants, I mean, our actions testify to the deep structural racism that is also enmeshed with exclusion and inequality. So, just skip forward here. So the European Union, with some stellar exceptions, most notably Germany, talks in anti-racist terms, but actually doesn't back it up with actions. In the most recent year we have figures for, in 2019, Ireland welcomed 83 refugees from Syria. Now, Syria has been caught in a brutal civil war for more than 10 years. And I've seen a longer queue outside Lidl to get some household bargain appliance than our entire country can welcome from a war zone that's just 3 hours flight from Dublin. So our actions testify to the reality in Francis's terms. In Francis's letter, he hammers this point home by reflecting on one of Jesus's most famous stories, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, if you remember the context, an expert in the law asks Jesus, how can he inherit eternal life? Jesus, as is his practice, maybe you've noticed this, whenever Jesus is asked a question, he tends to respond by asking a different, better question. So he responds to this young lawyer by saying, well, what's written in the law? And the guy gets the answer right. I warn you today that you should always beware of religiously serious young men who pride themselves on getting the answers right. I say that from experience. So he answers Jesus. He says, you inherit eternal life by loving the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and you have to love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus' advice is both simple and devastating, because who among us can fulfill it? Jesus says, do this and you will live. And the lawyer speaks for all of us when faced with such a universal demand, because he asks for a compromise. He asks for a slightly easier deal. He says, but Lord, who is my neighbor? He was looking for a lessening of the demands of the kingdom. And Jesus responds with a story that intensifies the claim made even further. And you know that story. Thieves set upon this traveler. They robbed him. They left him for dead. A priest walks by and, well, he walks by. A Levite, a sort of scribe, comes upon the man and goes on his way. Then after these upstanding citizens comes a real piece of trash Samaritan. You know, the kind with the accent and the posture and the attitude of entitlement. You know who I'm talking about. Every society has a group that stands in for the Samaritans, the group that is in our society but not of it, the group we exclude, the group we malign, the group we make live on the edges of our towns, the group we let die young, having lived in poverty, the group you don't want your children hanging around with, the group you expect nothing from because you have decided that they have nothing to offer. But the Samaritan stops. The Samaritan looks. The Samaritan, in the words of Luke, takes pity on him. And there is a revolution in that sentence. We think of pity as something bestowed by the strong, paternalistically on the weak. But Jesus tells us that this person from the bottom of the hierarchy had pity on a good, decent, upstanding citizen who was far above him in the social order. It's almost as if Jesus thinks that our social hierarchies are bogus. And the Samaritan goes further. On a road marked with risks, the bandits could come back and strike again. The Samaritan stops. The Samaritan made himself vulnerable. He bandaged the poor man's wounds. He poured out oil and wine, which were costly. He took him to an inn and he wrote a blank check for his care, promising to come back and settle all of the accounts in the victim's favor. And at the end of the story, Jesus turns back to the lawyer and he asks him, who was the neighbor in this story? And note the lawyer's answer, because I think Luke has preserved it word for word on purpose. The lawyer cannot bring himself to even say the word Samaritan. The same way a few moments ago when I was suggesting that every society as a group, they treat like the Samaritans, they treat like dirt. You and I wouldn't bring ourselves to actually name our prejudices. The fine, smart, pious lawyer can only beat around the bush. He says, the one who had mercy on him. We like to think that we don't have a problem with racism in Ireland because we don't have the Ku Klux Klan. But how many of us would be convicted if Jesus made the Samaritan a Nigerian or a traveler or a Muslim? Francis, in his relentless argument within the encyclical, states that it's regardless of the noble words we proclaim, it's how we arrange our political life and all the ways that we live our personal life that testifies to whether we really count everybody as a neighbor. The Samaritan set out to do something that day. He was busy. As Francis said, he has his own plans. But he let that fall by the wayside when he encountered this victim in the gutter. So policing our language is a noble first step towards a society that welcomes the distant neighbor. But it's a trivial endeavor if we're not willing to scrutinize our actions and our commitments. Francis asks us who we identify with in this parable. Subjectively, emotionally, all of us identify with the hero. We're so satisfied with the fact that we're numbered among the righteous that few of us ever stop to think that in societal terms, we are the robbers and the thieves. I am a Presbyterian theologian. We have a word for people who are comfortably satisfied with the fact that we are numbered among the righteous. It's ourselves. Francis is clear that this parable forces religious people, and I presume most of us all here today are included in that number, to reckon with how our agenda for righteousness and our convictions about what morality looks like are the most likely obstacles to us seeing our neighbor in need of help. We who are schooled in having the right answers are also trained by that very same school to walk on by because we have important work to do. And this is literally the truth. A famous study was done in the 1960s at the Presbyterian Seminary at Princeton. They set theologians to study this very text. And then they interrupted them with various kinds of urgent messages that summons them to a church building on the other side of the campus. Along the way, there were actors dressed as beggars who pleaded and called for help. And almost every single one of those sincere, decent, hard-working Christians passed those men by because they had a higher calling to answer to. Now, if you're anything like me, the immediate response that you have to hearing about the Princeton experiment is to tut-tut and to judge the seminarians who could so blatantly miss the point of Jesus's good news. But let's think into it a bit more. With reflection, we would all recognize that while we might hope ourselves to do a little bit better, there's always a conflict in our lives over who we should be paying attention to. Few people at this conference can explain the war in Yemen, or the challenges of surveillance capitalism, or the long-term climatological effects of methane production in the Irish agricultural system. We're all very vaguely aware that these are big, important issues that someone should be working to resolve. We know something is wrong with the treatment of the Uyghurs in Western China. We suspect that subsequent generations are going to hold us accountable as a genocide unfolded. But what can we say except we're busy? There's a pandemic. We're under pressure at work. We don't have the energy. What can we do? When we reflect, we find that the Princeton Seminary experiment is useful, not just because it confirms that religious people are hypocrites, that's the simple interpretation, but that the simple act of paying attention is more ethically significant than we might think. And I suppose if you take away one thing from this morning, that's my point. Paying attention is the beginning of all serious ethical action. In my own academic research, I've become very interested in how Christians have navigated this problem over the centuries. Jesus never engages in ethical deliberation in the abstract. He uses parables in part because they are inescapably personal. They're about people. There was a son who asks for his inheritance. There was a farmer who had to plant some seed. There was a woman who has lost a coin. Jesus's ethical teaching centers the act of paying attention to the actual people who are in front of us. The lawyer asks abstract questions, and Jesus responds with specific narratives. So the problem we gather today to reflect upon, it's an abstract one, and we shouldn't maybe be thinking about racism and exclusion in theory. The problem we have to address is how race excludes actual people in your town, in your village, in your school. Turning the stranger into neighbor and the neighbor into friend, this is the path we need to walk so that this stuff goes from theory to reality. And this demands our attention. I'm thankfully coming towards the end here. In so short a time, I cannot give you a full account of how racism functions in Ireland today. But I can warn you that it is not the caricature, black and white moral fable of Hollywood tales. It hides under the surface. The Irish variant of the virus called racism surely emerges out of a historical ecosystem of sectarianism. It begins for us with the hatred between the Catholics and the Protestants. And we have that in common with the first hearers of Jesus's parable. Who were the Samaritans after all? But the first recorded case of superism in history. You're familiar with the idea of superism? Remember the efforts by the British evangelists to convince Irish Catholics to become Anglicans during the famine by offering food in exchange for conversion. The reason the Samaritans were so despised by the Jews is because they took the soup. They compromised with the invading Babylonians. So Irish racism can be directed towards skin tone, as every single person of color on this island can tell you. But it can also target, maybe it even primarily targets, the white people we call travelers. At least that's the name settled people use when they're in public, though we all know that the names used for travelers in private are much more offensive. Catholics are no longer scared of Protestants, as this morning testifies. But that doesn't mean that we're cured of religious intolerance. I sometimes think that contemporary, prosperous, progressive, post-Christian Ireland is just one or two scandals away from revealing its deep antipathy towards Islam. There's a deep current of anti-Islamic feeling in mainstream Irish culture. So we're not immune from this virus, and we are suffering a pandemic. But the news isn't all bad. To go back to the story from the start, Granville Sharp was walking back to work one day when he encountered Jonathan Strong. He paid attention. He stopped. He took pity on him. He changed the course of his day, and that changed the course of his life. And together, these two men changed for the better, immeasurably better, the course of their nation's history. So the real life enacting of the parable of the Good Samaritan matters to us in Ireland today, because it shows us that the path to suppressing racism and to encouraging equality and inclusion and the kind of society where everyone is welcome is down that road. Sharp and Strong didn't tackle their problem in the abstract. Instead, they made friends. Sharp and Strong didn't tackle this problem just by making friends. They went to war against the oppressive societal structures that replicated this injustice. So thinking about the parable of the Good Samaritan reminds us that ethics never begins in the abstract. It always addresses the concrete, fleshy reality of who is our neighbor. The Samaritan didn't just heed the man and have pity. He put his resources on the line to remedy the situation. And reflecting on the concrete resonances in the story of Strong and Sharp reminds us that the personal relational dynamic of befriending the other is incomplete unless it is paired with structural change. So coming back to where we began, Pope Francis urges us in that recent letter Fratelli Tutti to think about this combination as social friendship. The fact that we're all brothers and sisters and that the person in trouble before us is our responsibility under God's sight, regardless of how they came to be there, regardless of what we thought our responsibility was before we met them. The concrete other changes our priorities. So social friendship locates the relationships that we're called to cultivate. And then it does so in the context of the social and cultural and political and economic exclusions and inequalities that we face. We have to fight both of those things together. So I want to finish with just one example of this. I run a social analysis center for the Jesuits. And so I have to bring some social policy in. The health service, the HSE, classifies members of the traveling community as elderly when they turn 40. I turned 40 in November. The reason why is because while 20% of Irish people in general are over 65, only 3% of the traveling community are over 65. So you actually statistically become old if you're a traveler at the age of 40. Now, if such short life expectancies, such dramatically shorter life expectancies, do not testify to the profound racism in our society, then we are not paying attention. We can't even begin to take pity on someone if we're not paying attention. We could array a towering collection of similar statistics to paint a more accurate portrait of the exclusions, the legal, economic, social, religious exclusions that afflict those people who get excluded from our category of neighbor. But the statistics have no effect. They're literally just a bunch of abstract numbers on a page until we pay attention to the people who are actually included. Racism and social inequality are two sides of the same coin. We discard those we despise, and we despise that which we discard. So like Sharp and Strong, we have to fight our personal alienation from the other and the societal domination over the other. We have to build relationships and deconstruct systems. It's the two together. So we have to lobby. We have to be careful about our consumerism. We have to protest. We have to fight the exclusion by every non-violent means available. But approaching exclusion in terms of relationships without the systemic analysis, that's just sentimentality. And the systemic analysis without the friendships, that's just technocracy. By transcending both, we find the good news. So let me close by saying Christianity continues to have potent cultural significance. Jesus's divine yarn about a Samaritan has been badly misunderstood as a banal tale about generically doing good, but really it's an incendiary invitation to tear down the walls our society erects to divide people. So I want to close with some questions to ponder. Hopefully they're visible there. We can copy and paste them into the chat. But the questions are, how do examples like Sharp and Strong help us to imagine a response to racism, inequality, and exclusion? What societal factors might be at play to encourage us to depict racism as a personal failing? By which I mean, why are we trained to think that racism is just a thing that an individual bad person does, instead of thinking about it societally? If racism and exclusion and inequality always go together, then what political, legal, and structural changes do we have to fight for to fight these problems? And finally, how might this idea of social friendship play out in your context? Thank you.
Thank you indeed very much for very inspiring and very challenging. And I'm sorry that we didn't have a whole lot more time to hear what you had to say, Kevin. It's extremely interesting, and you have set us indeed some difficult questions to ponder, but you've given us a very good basis on which we can begin to look at some of the questions that you ask. There is so much in what you say that has resonated just for me in terms of what I've heard, even that we're grounded, that I suppose the whole idea of social friendship and that our brothers and our sisters are our own responsibility. And what I like too is the whole idea of paying attention as being the beginning of all ethical action, and that we must pay attention, I suppose, to those in front of us more so. The challenges are there for us all, and that you ask us then that we must examine the progress of Irish society, and that what really struck with me is that we're addicted to making groups that are in and groups that are out. And we can do this sometimes through the camouflage of banter. So we are kind of challenged ourselves to see where is it that we are at relative to these issues that Kevin has brought up with us. There is plenty to think on. And I might just remind you maybe of some of the questions that Kevin has asked. He has asked us, how do examples like Sharp and Strong help us to imagine a response to racism, inequality, and exclusion? That was the first question. And the second one, what societal factors might be at play to encourage us to depict racism as a personal failing? And the third question then, if racism and exclusion and inequality are always go together, what political, legal, and structural changes do we have to fight for or to fight these problems? And the last one, how might this idea of social friendship play out in our context, being responsible, that is, for our brothers and sisters? Kevin, thank you so much again for all that you've shared with us this morning. And what we would hope now is that we might break up into groups for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And we now have 100 people online, which is absolutely marvelous. There is no way that we're going to be able to get a feedback from every single group. So what we're hoping for is that in each group that Mariam has devised, that in each group that somebody might take a few notes and that they might send them to Mariam afterwards. And that therefore we can capture the essence of what comes back in the groups. But what we will do after the groups have had a chance to think on what Kevin has brought to our attention this morning, that we might call on 3 or 4 groups given the time, and immediately after that then we might call on Kevin again, maybe just to come back in based on some of the comments that he has heard from some of the groups, and after that then we might take that photograph before we all head for a cup of tea. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm just going to, I think we're going to try and put the questions in the chat, but I might just remind you, firstly, the examples of Sharp and Strong, how do they help us to imagine a response to racism, inequality, and inclusion? And the other question, what societal factors might be at play to encourage us to depict racism as a personal failing? And the third one, if racism and exclusion and inequality always go together, what political, legal, and structural changes do we have to fight for to fight these problems? And lastly, how might this idea of social friendship play out in your context? Now, I appreciate you won't have a lot of time to go through all of those questions, but you know, if you manage to take one or another of them, then that would be wonderful. So I'm going to invite Marianne to break us into the various groups. And if you remember in your groups then to unmute yourselves, and we will come back to you maybe in between 10 and 15 minutes and before we head for a cup of tea. So enjoy the chance to have a chat, and we'll talk to you again in a few moments. Marianne, you might do the needful there, so thank you.